Hi, and welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I'm exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. Today we have an Islamic scholar on, Andy Bannister. He's got a PhD in Islamic studies, and we're talking about 3 reasons why Muslims ought to take Christianity seriously. We'll get to those 3 reasons in a second, but let me go ahead and just introduce my guest, Dr. Andy Bannister. Is this a quarantine haircut that you got going on? Because I've watched some of your other videos, and you had some longer hair.
Oh, yeah. This is good to be with you, Cameron. This is the lockdown haircut. My wife looked at my head the other night and went, right, the clippers are coming out. So, yes, this is a COVID cut.
COVID cut. Oh, I like that. That's a lot better. Yeah, so I have a haircut scheduled for tomorrow. So that's I'm so looking forward to that. My hair, yeah, it's ridiculous. It took me a couple weeks because in Texas stuff opened up pretty quickly, but it took me a couple weeks just to get in with my barber. So hopefully tomorrow works out. And let's get into it. So, recently we just all heard the very sad news that Ravi Zacharias went on to be with the Lord. And so I wanted to ask you, as you work with him, you've worked with him personally. So do you have any personal anecdotes that you can think of that the audience might benefit from just in remembering him?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for asking that, Cameron. And we're all sort of stunned, all of us who knew him. It was only a few months ago the cancer diagnosis came. Only a few weeks ago, we knew it was untreatable. And I think we hoped we'd have a few weeks yet. And then suddenly he died earlier this week. And I guess, yeah, in terms of anecdotes, I mean, there are so many that one could tell. But I think some of the stories I like, Cameron, are anyone who's familiar with Ravi knows the kind of big stuff. You know, we've seen the YouTube of him standing in front of 20,000 people and answering Q&A and doing all that stuff brilliantly. What I appreciate about Ravi was also the personal touch. You know, for all of us on the team, he took the time, he got to know us, he knew out the names of our families and our kids and would always ask after them. Even after I left the team, was no longer a full-time team member. Every time my birthday came around every year, I'd get a personal kind of email. And but then all that extended to even people he'd only met occasionally. I remember one occasion I was having a breakfast meeting with him in Toronto. I was their Canadian director for a while, and we were in a hotel having a breakfast there in Toronto. And this waitress came over to serve us, and Ravi looked at her and said, "Oh, it's Deborah, isn't it? I met you 2 years ago." And he basically remembered her name, her husband's name. There'd been a situation with her child. He said, "I believe one of your children was sick, right? How's that going?" And the look on this woman's face that here was Ravi, who knew all of these details, and then he reached into his bag and gave her a book as a gift and signed it for her. And his ability to connect one-to-one right down at that kind of level, as well as do the big stuff, was incredible. So yeah, incredible presence on the stage, but cared about people that other people didn't, ignored. A lot of people don't notice who's serving them at a table. Ravi would notice those people and take an interest, and the Lord used that tremendously.
That's incredible. I when I hear stories about that, people who, I mean, 'cause I think about my own memory, and my memory is pretty bad. Yeah. So when I hear stories like that, it really impresses me. But that's really cool. I mean, it's not just the ability to remember something like that. I think it's also the fact that some of our memory is selective, and so the fact that he puts effort, I think, into remembering details like that is just sort of speaks to his character. Well, so Dr. Bannister, Andy here, he holds a PhD in Islamic studies and is an adjunct research fellow at the Arthur Jeffrey Center for the Study of Islam at Melbourne School of Theology. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that as in terms of an introduction? Because this is your first time on the channel.
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you, and I wear and juggle a whole variety of hats, Cameron. The other one I'd throw in there is I'm based in the UK. Now I was in Canada for some years with Ravi Zacharias Ministries. I now head up an organization called SOLAS, the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, and that's a small Christian organization based in Scotland, up in the north of the UK, really just seeking to explain and defend the Christian faith and give a reason why as Christians we believe what we believe. If folks want to find out more, SOLAS, SOLAS, just stick that into Google or Facebook and you'll find us. So I spend a lot of my time doing that work as well.
Excellent. Well, so as I was looking into you and your background, I noticed that you're a photographer.
Yeah, so one of my kind of hobbies, I'm not doing this kind of stuff, is photography and, believe it or not, drone flying. I got into drone flying 3 or 4 years ago, and particularly kind of flying, we've got great mountains and beaches and rivers and landscapes here in Scotland. And so, yeah, I'm an amateur, but I do love getting the drone up and doing my best to sort of try and do some epic footage. Failing usually.
Tell me, that's really cool. I never got into drone stuff, and I kind of wish that I had, but I kind of got out of the whole. Sorry, I've got some noise behind me, so don't worry about it. It should be okay. I'm actually going to pass it over to you in just a second, so you can answer some questions. I'll mute my microphone. Well, tell me why a Christian decided to get a PhD in Islamic studies. Let's start with that.
Yeah, that is the $100,000 question, right? So the simple answer to that, Cameron, is back in the mid 1990s. I hadn't really thought much about apologetics or giving a reason for the hope that I have. I was a youth worker for a group of churches in London, but one Saturday morning, a gentleman came to our church and did a seminar on Islam. And in particular described how every Sunday afternoon he was going up to one of our parks in London, Hyde Park, and there's a place there called Speaker's Corner, and at Speaker's Corner you can stand on a ladder or a box, or if you're my height, a ladder and a couple of boxes, and you can speak and you'll get a crowd. And he was finding actually there were lots of Muslims there, and this was a great way to reach out to the Muslim community. And we got talking after his seminar, and he was a very charismatic speaker. And so his name was Jay Smith, and he said to me, "Well, why don't you come to Speaker's Corner next week, Andy, and see what we do?" So the following weekend, I went up to Speaker's Corner, and to be met by him at the train station with not just one but two ladders. And so I said, "Well, Jay, why have you got two ladders?" He went, "One is for me to preach on, one is for you to preach on." I said, "Buddy, I thought you said come and see what we do." He went, "Oh, the best view is from a ladder." I said, I've never preached in public." He went, "Oh, it's easy." I said, "I've never talked to Muslims before." "Oh, they're easy." Both those statements, Cameron, were wrong, because I got up on that ladder and the Muslims at Speaker's Corner, they knew how to take Christians to pieces, and they demolished me. They had questions, they had objections. I had nothing. And I went home, really at that point thinking, well, maybe I need to become a Muslim because they seem to have everything and I have nothing. And I lay awake that night, tossing and turning and worrying. And about 3 a.m, my long-suffering wife poked me in the ribs and said, "Why are you tossing and turning and keeping us both awake?" And I told her my story. And her wise words were, "Well, why don't you read a book? Ideally in the morning, not at 3 a.m. So the following morning, I went to the local Christian bookstore, told them my story. And that was the first time I heard the word apologetics, because they said, "Well, you need apologetics." And I asked what that was, and they explained. And so I bought some books, read those books, went back to Speaker's Corner 2 weeks later with answers to every question they'd asked me. I was loaded for bear, as we say in Canada. And that was all very well, but my Muslim friends had new questions, and I looked stupid all over again. And for the next 3 months, that's what I would do. I would go to Speaker's Corner, stand on a ladder, and be faced with a sort of machine gunning of questions that I couldn't answer, read to get the answers. And over those 3 months, God gave me a love of defending my faith in public, of really digging into the reasons why Christianity is true. Gave me a love actually of Muslims and really engaging with them. And that also opened the door then to further study. I was 28 at this point, hadn't been to university, wasn't from a university going family, but figured I needed to dig into this. So I did a degree in philosophy and theology, and then off the back of that started a PhD in Islamic studies, because I really wanted to pursue some of those questions, particularly about the origins of the Quran. So it was Muslims on the street in London asking me difficult questions in 1997. That's where it all began.
Well, tell me, what did your PhD, what was your dissertation on?
Yeah, that's a dangerous question to ask someone with a PhD, because we're tempted to rabbit on for ages. But in a nutshell, one of the arguments that my Muslim friends would use in London all those years ago was they would say, look, the Quran is a miracle. And the reason it's a miracle is because it's written in beautiful Arabic. It's this beautiful, literary work. But Mohammed was illiterate. He came from an oral culture. He didn't know how to read and write. So how could a man who couldn't read and write produce a book like the Quran? Therefore, it must be a miracle. Ta-da! Now, if you think about each of those statements, that's a pretty powerful argument, actually. How does somebody who can't read and write produce something like the Quran? Until you suddenly realize and discover that we have examples of dozens of cultures around the world that at a time when they didn't have reading and writing produced great works of literature. Classic example would be Homer, the Greek poet, not the little guy on The Simpsons. Homer, the Greek poet, his poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the foundation of Western literature, that comes from before writing. So how did he do it? And it turns out there are tools and techniques and methods you can use as an oral person to create pretty sophisticated works of literature, often live in front of an audience. You stand in front of the audience and sort of create live in front of them. Not quite improvisation, but similar to that. And what's interesting is when that work is then written down, be it the works of Homer or Quran, it leaves its mark on the text, and there are things we can look for as scholars in the texts that show us they were composed that way. And we've done that for works like Homer and hundreds of other oral documents. In a nutshell, I took all those techniques that have been used in other traditions, applied them to the Quran, and the Quran looks entirely like a document that was produced in that kind of culture. So it's not a miracle. It looks like a very human product. It's got human fingerprints all over it. They're just oral fingerprints, not literary fingerprints.
Yeah, this is interesting. It sounds like what you did with your PhD, your dissertation, was basically took one of the objections or one of the arguments that you heard while you were studying Islam, and were like, well, this seems like a good one. Did you also look and see if it had been addressed anywhere by anyone at length? Or did you see that was lacking, and so that's another motivation for going into it?
Yeah, certainly that work hadn't been done, or rather, actually, it's slightly more interesting that what had been done is one of the to go a little bit into the sort of science of it. One of the features that we see in oral tradition, Cameron, is that texts that come from oral cultures often use short repeated phrases time and time again. They're called oral formulae, because if you're performing live in front of an audience, you haven't got the time to think of every word, so you tend to use sort of bigger building blocks. We have echoes of this in our culture. We were chatting before the show, right? And you've got small children, like I've got small children, and if one of your kids comes in and says, Daddy, can you tell me the story of the three little pigs? How are you going to start that story? What's the first thing you say when you start a fairy tale?
I'm going to say because I have to think about it.
Once upon a time, right? This is great. You're not used to being asked the questions. Once upon a time is the right answer, and that's an example of a formulaic phrase that's still in our culture. And one of the things that you can do is you can take a text and you can see what percentage of it consists of these short repeated phrases. And for Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, for example, 25% of the text is these short repeated phrases. Now, somebody had done this work on the Quran, but they'd done it in English. They'd gone through the Quran using a concordance and looked for these kind of repeated phrases in English. And the Muslim critique had been, if you looked at the Arabic, you wouldn't see these patterns. And so what I basically did was come along, and I'd got a background in computer science, and so I actually wrote some computer software to do this analysis of the Quran in Arabic and show that actually it's not 25% of the Quran, it's almost 50% of the Quran consists of these short repeated phrases that are recycled and reused time and time and time and time again, which is a classic example of oral tradition. So I guess I was kind of standing on the shoulders of giants. The idea was not original to me, but I saw a massive, as it were, gap in the market where someone needed to come along and do this rigorously. And what's exciting actually is now other scholars are building on it. Scholars who are much more brilliant than me. I'm amazed that I ended up with a PhD. I feel like an amateur, but there are really, really smart people who are now taking the stuff that I pioneered and building on it. And that's been exciting to see that the conversation has changed. I think there's more of an awareness of this material now in the Quran and this kind of background to the Quran.
Should we talk about Gabriel Said Reynolds at all and how? Yeah.
Do you want to introduce who he is, or I can do that? So
yeah,
Gabriel,
go ahead.
We were talking again before the show. So Gabriel is another example of somebody who comes from a kind of Christian background, but is a brilliant scholar of Islam. There are many of us kind of working in this area. He's based at Notre Dame University, and he's pioneered, I think, a lot of work looking at the connections between the Quran and other traditions. So over on the side of my desk here, I have one of his most recent books, this big fat, The Quran and the Bible. It's massive. You'll see, you could sort of use that to build houses out of. And that basically traces through all the links. The word we use in scholarship is intertextuality, the connection between the Quran and other texts. And it turns out the Quran, roughly 25% of the Quran actually, consists of material that's come from kind of Jewish and Christian tradition, either from the Bible or from rabbinic material or kind of apocryphal Christian stories and so forth. And what's interesting, Cameron, this fits the orality idea I introduced a moment ago. It's not that the Quran copies word for word, but it retells the story. So a really good example would be there's a story in the Quran called The Story of Iblis and Adam. And it's a story of how, after God has created Adam, he brings the angels into the throne room of heaven and shows them the newly created Adam. And God commands the angels to bow down before Adam. And all the angels bow apart from one, whose name is Iblis in the Quran. He refuses and has a bit of a hissy fit and says, I'm not going to bow to that. You know, you made me out of fire. You made that thing out of clay. And for that is thrown out of heaven and becomes Satan. And that story is told 7 times in the Quran. Well, it started life as a Jewish legend. It was a legend told in sort of Jewish tradition about 100 BC. Then it gets picked up and retold by Christians in the 300s and 400s, really as a kind of pious story for people. Wasn't taken as scripture. It was just a sort of pious fairy tale. And then it ends up retold in the Quran. And so it's interesting to see how the Quran retells this kind of material. And of course, if you're a Muslim who believes the Quran came directly from heaven with no human intervention, that's a big problem. And Gabriel is one of many scholars who's really pioneered looking at those kind of connections, exposing them, discussing them, and helping us see what's going on.
Yeah, with Gabriel, the reason why I wanted to talk about him is because I was listening actually to that exact book that you just had up, the Bible and the Quran. How should we pronounce that, by the way? Quran?
Well, there's a whole debate there. If you wanted to be really kind of, sort of show that you know your stuff, you want to put it back further in the throat. Quran is what you really want to try. Even that's not quite deep enough. A real Arabic speaker would say my British accent was coming through there. But yes, Quran is how you want to try and do it.
Interesting. All right. Well, I'm not going to try that. But
no, I get laughed at by Muslim friends who tell me my pronunciation.
So the reason why I mentioned Gabriel is because I was reading his book, and that one was really difficult to get through as an audiobook. So I kind of stopped halfway through. I listened to his introduction to Islam, and that one was amazing. It was so good. A great introduction. I highly recommend that. So anyone who's interested, obviously yes. you have some books as well, so look into to Andy's work. But Gabriel, I think we can both agree he's so charitable. He's a great scholar. He's awesome. Well, let's do one last thing before we get into the 3 different reasons why Muslims ought to take Christianity seriously. And I want to ask you a question that I've actually done a whole show on this, and you're writing a whole book on this. So, yes. But in any case, I'm going to ask you to give me like a 1-minute answer. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God?
Well, the funny thing is, my daughter keeps joking, Daddy, why are you writing a book on this? Because the one-word answer is no. So the simplistic answer is no, but let's unpack it very quickly in a minute to maybe 90 seconds to go. When somebody asks that question, Cameron, we need to ask a question back and say, what do you mean by God? Because neither the Bible or the Quran believe in a God who's kind of an abstract philosophical idea, who's just a concept, but both the Bible and the Quran flesh out what God is like. And in the case of the Bible, I would say there are some key characteristics to what God is like. He's a God who's relational. We see that from almost every page of the scriptures. He's a God who can be known. The Bible is very clear that it's not just God's laws that you can know, but you can know God personally. The Bible makes that clear on page after page. He's a God who is love. In fact, in 1 John chapter 4, verse 16, the Bible says God is love. Love is something the God of the Bible is, not just something the God of the Bible does. And he's a God who's demonstrated that love by suffering in the person of Jesus there on the cross. So those are 4 key characteristics of God. Turn to the Quran and look at Allah, and the Quran either rejects or outrightly denies each of those characteristics. Allah is not a relational God. He can't be known. He is not a God who is love, and he is certainly not a God who has suffered. So the attributes look different. And I think what's going on, Cameron, to put it in a simple analogy as I wrap this up, is I say, look, if you and I were debating about the president of the USA, and I say I believe in one president, and you say, that's great, I believe in one president. And I say, well, who do you think the president is? And you say, I think it's Donald Trump. And I say, I think it's Donald Duck. Well, we might argue about who might be the most effective president, and maybe our politics would come out. But clearly we've got an issue. We both believe in one president, but we disagree about the identity of that president. And I think that's what's going on with the Quran and the Bible. But the one caveat I'd put on the end is I think many Muslims, although the Quran doesn't teach the same God as the God of the Bible, they are still yearning for the God of the Bible. If I meet Muslims who tell me they believe in a God of love, I never turn around and say, oh, no, you don't. The Quran doesn't say that. I go to Acts 17 as my example, Paul at the altar to the unknown God. And I'll always say to my Muslim friends, you're right. God is a God of love, but let me tell you who that God is. You're describing to me now the God of the Bible, not the God of the Quran. So the God of the Bible and the God of the Quran, utterly different. But I think many Muslims are seeking, even though they may not yet know it, for the God of the Bible.
You said your daughter, was it your daughter who said there's no reason to write a book?
Why didn't I write a one-word book?
Yeah, exactly. 7. So it was the previous show that I did that really introduced me to the complexities, and I still am just super confused about what the correct answer to this is. I think that what the previous guy, he's a philosopher, Christian philosopher, his name is Thomas Bogardus. And so if you're interested, not just you, Andy, but if anyone's watching this and interested in checking out that discussion that I had with him, the interview that we did, he wrote a paper on it recently. And so basically what he says is that for some people, yes, for some people, no. So it's just really complicated, and there's a whole lot of things going on in philosophy of language and all this stuff. So it's really interesting. Definitely an interesting episode. But if you want to get more of Andy's thoughts, when is your book going to be out?
Well, there's a question. So it's due to the publisher by September and coming out early next year. But the big takeaway to listeners, Cameron, I'd say, is whether, my approach or the other gentleman's approach, when someone uses the word God, always ask, what do you mean by that? This goes for atheists too. When atheists tell you they don't believe in God, ask them what they think they mean by that word. Because God is one of those slippery words that we need to define and give content to.
All right, well, let's do the first thing. So going back to the title of the show today, 3 reasons why Muslims ought to take Christianity seriously. What is the number one reason in your mind why they ought to?
Okay, well, I think there are 3 things we'll look at. We'll look at the Quran, we'll look at the founder, and then we'll look at the nature of God, actually, to a degree at the end. I think those might have been the 3 I gave you. I always interchange them. But let's begin with the first one. You see, I think what's interesting, Cameron, is that the Islam stands on 2 pillars. It stands on the pillar of the Quran, and it stands on the pillar of Mohammed. And we've already touched a little bit on the Quran, but we can unpack this. And I want to begin by saying to Muslims, the problem is the claims made for the Quran don't stand up. The claim that it came directly from heaven with no human intervention simply doesn't stand up. The Quran looks like the product of an individual from 7th century Arabia. It looks like the kind of an oral document would from that context. In fact, if I had never read the Quran, but I knew what I knew about oral tradition, and you said to me, okay, I've got this document here, it's come from a 7th century Bedouin in Arabia, what do you think some of the features might be? I would describe them to you, and then you'd open the Quran and find them there. So the Quran doesn't look like it came directly from heaven with no human intervention. Then we have the issue that we touched on with Gabriel's work, feeds into this. The Quran contains myths and legends, and it jumbles them up with no real way for the reader to determine which is true and which isn't, in such a way that you suspect the author of the Quran didn't know. It was very interesting, actually, that I did a debate in Canada about 3 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago, with one of the Muslim world's leading apologists. His name is Shabir Ali. And Shabir is very articulate, lovely gentleman. I mean, one of the kindest, sweetest men you would meet. I always enjoy spending time with him. He's incredibly kind, but very rigorous. And what was interesting was he, in recent years, has had to begin admitting that the Quran contains myths and legends and fables. And in our discussion, we talked about this, and he tried to say, well, it's okay that the Quran does this. It contains things like the story of Iblis and Adam. It uses these for teaching purposes, as illustrative stories and so forth. And I said to him, the problem, Shabir, is the Quran doesn't tell you that's what it's doing. The Muslim reader who hasn't got, your background and my background would simply open up the Quran and it would see these stories and they would have no way of knowing, is this history, is this not history? The Quran jumbles them all together.
Can you give me an example?
Well, a good example of that would be the story of Iblis and Adam. The Quran often just introduces these earlier stories with a little phrase, remember the story of, or consider the story of, and it will introduce the story of Jesus that way, or Abraham, or Moses. It will also use it for Iblis and Adam and those kind of stories. So there's simply no way of you knowing as a reader, well, here I'm dealing with a story or a parable. Here I'm dealing with history. Compare that, say, with the Gospels. When Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son, for example, he doesn't stand up and go, well, let me tell you a piece of history. He stands up and says, let me tell you a story where there was once a man who had, 2 sons. He introduces it in a way, the equivalent to once upon a time. So the Quran contains all of this material jumbled together. Other problem, I think, with the Quran, I would say, is historically it is incredibly confused. If you were to just have the Quran and nothing else, you would have no way of knowing, for example, that Moses and Jesus were separated by some 1,500 years. Massive, difference historically between them. The Quran jumbles them up together, puts their stories right next to each other. In fact, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is even called the sister of Aaron at one point, because the Quran seems to confuse her with Miriam in the Old Testament. That's a well-known historical problem in the Quran. So again, the Quran seems to be a little bit confused. Again, I often say to my Muslim friends, Jesus turns up in about 90 verses of the Quran. But if we just had the Quran, we wouldn't know when Jesus lived, where Jesus lived. We wouldn't know the historical context, the geographical context, none of these things. So the Quran seems to be sort of retelling stories secondhand and losing a lot of the key stuff along the way. So those would be three problems. There are many, many more. That it looks like a very human product. We can see how it was put together. It jumbles up myth and legend and history. And even when it tries to tell history, it doesn't really know what it's doing. And it basically, I would say, as a scholar of the Quran now for 20 years, Cameron, that I think what's going on is, Muhammad, as he sort of traveled around Arabia, as he bumped into Christians and Jews in the marketplaces and the bazaars, heard their stories, and when he begins preaching Islam, draws upon this tradition that he's heard secondhand and retells it, but doesn't have the framework into which to put it, which explains why, it's a little bit piecemeal. So yeah, those would be three problems with the Quran to start with.
So I just wanted to let the audience know that we are going to do some Q&A with Dr. Bannister. So if you have a question for him, anything related to Islam, basically anything, it's fair game. So if you have a question for him, then just don't write it in live chat yet. If you do it as a super chat, I'll be able to go back through and pull it up once we start doing that. But so just wanted to give you a heads up. We are going to do some Q&A in just a little bit. Now, a question that I wanted to ask you was, one of the things that I found interesting as I was listening to the introduction from Reynolds is that I learned that the Quran, I'm just going to say Quran, and hopefully
just
people don't give me too bad. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. As it was first written and then copies were sent out and made, there was it one or two times when the Quran was taken basically by whoever was in charge at the time, they destroyed all the other ones, and that is the Quran that we have today.
Yeah, that is correct. The very, very famous example of that comes when Muhammad died in 632 AD, Cameron. Muhammad was succeeded by a line of rulers known as the caliphs. And particularly the first four are very significant. That's often considered by many Muslims, especially Sunni Muslims, to be the kind of golden era of Islam. And under those first four caliphs, and under the third caliph, so we're talking now sort of 10, 15 years. And there's a big debate.
Sorry to jump in again, but there's a big debate about which caliph should be the one that took the reign, so to speak, and even today, the difference between Sunni Muslims and
briefly, absolutely. Your listeners will be maybe familiar with the fact that there are some big groupings of Muslims, big major sects. Sunni Muslims are by far the majority, biggest sect. Then you've got a group known as the Shiites, the Shia, and they're about sort of 10 to 15% of Muslims worldwide. And there's not been a lot of love lost between Sunnis and Shiites over the years. Think about the Iran-Iraq war a few decades ago, and actually there's been bloodshed down the centuries. And the reason there's problems between those two communities all goes back to the succession. When Muhammad died in 632 AD, he didn't leave a male heir. He'd had many wives, but hadn't produced much in the way of children. And so there were really two groups of Muslims. There were a group of Muslims, his close friends and sort of leaders in the community, who thought that actually the elders should come together and pick the next leader. But there was another group who believed that actually Muhammad's closest male relative, Ali, his son-in-law, that he should be the leader. And there was a big kind of bust up over this. Ali's party lost that debate, and in fact, the term Shia is an abbreviation of Shia Ali, the party of Ali, and they lost out. And the first three caliphs were other men. Ali eventually comes to the throne, as the fourth caliph. But by then the Muslim community is collapsing into civil war, and there's a big bust up, a big battle, and Ali's sons are slain in that conflict, and the Sunnis were blamed for that. And so Shiites and Sunnis today are not necessarily on the best of terms.
And this is all tied into the history. It was so interesting.
Yeah, it's a very interesting early history, actually.
Yeah.
I often say to people, if you want to understand Islam, yeah, you could read the Quran, but it's not easy because it jumps around from topic to topic. There's often context missing. If you want to understand why Islam looks the way it does today, you've got to look at Muhammad, and we'll come to him in a moment, and you've got to look at that early formative period of Islam. Because take the common question that's asked today, is Islam a religion of peace or not? That question often turns up. Well, the problem is the Quran speaks with two voices. You can find peaceful verses and non-peaceful verses. But we can get more clarity if we look at Muhammad, and we can get more clarity if we look at the way the early caliphs behaved, the men who were really close to Muhammad, and how they figured that Islam should be interpreted as it went from being a sort of tribal religion to something bigger.
So
but in terms of your... Go on, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to bring it back to the topic of the Quran being all of the other versions being destroyed, and then we just have this one here. Yeah. So to me, that seems like textual criticism with the Bible. Like there was never an opportunity to do anything like that, and I think Reynolds might even point that out as well. I've heard it from other Christian apologists too, is that there was never an opportunity to just like round up all of the different manuscripts of the New Testament or the Old Testament and destroy ones that we didn't like and keep the ones that we did like or we decided that we liked. And so that just kind of raises a whole lot of questions about you.
Yes.
You can assume that God was sort of in charge of the whole process, but it does kind of seem a little non-divine, the whole that process that happened. So, any more thoughts there? Because I think this is related to this first point about the Quran.
It is very much so. So to come back to the Quran, Cameron, so under the reign of the third Caliph Uthman, so we're talking about 10, 15 years after Muhammad, we read in the Hadith, and for people not familiar with that term, the Quran obviously is the scripture of Islam, but then a few centuries after Muhammad's death, Muslims began collecting traditions about what Muhammad said and did and what went on in that early period of history, and those were edited together and published as the Hadith. And they're just sort of short traditions about what was said and what was done and so forth. And particularly for Sunni Muslims, they are not quite as authoritative as the Quran, but it's pretty close. They are the sort of second most important text they have. And if we look in the Hadith, so we're looking in Muslim histories themselves, not outsider histories, not critical histories, Muslims themselves. The Muslim historians themselves in the Hadith tell us that reports reached Uthman that soldiers up on the battlefield. So at this point, the Islamic armies were expanding Islam. They were pushing the borders of the empire up into places like Syria and so forth. And reports reached Uthman that soldiers on the battlefield were arguing with one another about how the Quran should be recited, what the Quran actually said. And soldiers from some parts of the Muslim empire were following one particular codex of the Quran, others were following another, and it was getting quite nasty. And so an envoy comes to the caliph and says, look, you've got to sort this out, or the Muslim community will divide, terribly. And we read in the Hadith that then Uthman sent word to the four corners of the Muslim empire asking for every Quranic manuscript, whether in whole copies or just part copies, to be sent to him. And then he organized a small committee led by a gentleman called Zayd ibn Thabit, who had been Muhammad's personal secretary, to make one authoritative version of the Quran and then make 4 copies of that. And then all the other manuscripts, and this is the controversial bit, were to be burnt, were to be destroyed by burning. And so you're dead right there. We're talking 10, 15 years, just the first couple of decades after Muhammad. Islam has scarcely got going. We have wholesale destruction of manuscripts. And as a scholar of the early Quran, that's hugely frustrating, because if you read the Hadith, you get little clues in places that there was other stuff going on. Like the Hadith refer to, at one point, apparently the Quran seemed to have contained a verse prescribing stoning for adultery. And you can hear references to that in the Hadith. That verse is not there today. The inscription at the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem looks like the Quran, but it's not quite the Quran. So there's lots of clues that there was fluidity going on. But Uthman came along and kind of destroyed all that. And as you say, for Christianity, the big difference here, and I often raise this with Muslim friends, is look, Christians have never engaged in a wholesale destruction of manuscripts. You can find one or two bad examples of scholars misbehaving in history. That's always the case. You can find the Roman authorities burning manuscripts when Christians were persecuted. But no Christian scholar ever had the idea of let's collect all the darn manuscripts together and burn every single competing copy. Not even Constantine, when he became a Christian, who loved to try and impose, a particular doctrine and didn't like dispute. He didn't try and use his power to do it. I think for a number of reasons, but the big one being by that point the scriptures were so widespread it would have been all but impossible. That's often remarked upon in early Christianity, how rapidly the Gospels, particularly, and the New Testament spread out. Take the book of Romans that Paul writes in the early part of the first century. He's writing there to a church he's never visited, but all the things he can assume about Christian belief, he hasn't got to argue for any of them. Christianity has reached the other end of the Roman Empire in a couple of decades. And so I think it would have been impossible. Uthman, on the other hand, had the ability. The Islamic Empire was small enough at that point, and so he puts that into practice. So that raises all kinds of questions, particularly what was it that he saw there? That's the question I always ask my Muslim friends. What did he see that he was so concerned about? It clearly wasn't a minor spelling difference. It was enough that he felt he had to consign manuscripts to the flames.
Right. Since I learned that, I've always thought about the objection that you get from Muslims. Oh, the Gospels have been changed; they've been corrupted, and I think that actually seems to apply more to the Quran than it does to the New Testament because of this whole situation. It seems like the shoe's on the other foot.
Well, very much so. And in fact, a really dear friend of mine who died a year or two ago, whose name is Keith Small. And Keith was a good friend of myself and Gabriel. And Keith pioneered work on textual criticism of Quranic manuscripts. In fact, his academic book is called Textual Criticism of Quran Manuscripts. You can find it on Amazon if you put his name into Amazon. Other booksellers are available, I guess I should say. And yeah, that was almost effectively Keith's thesis, that that kind of charge of corruption. He also interacted with people like Bart Ehrman, who liked to sort of come along and suggest that Christians had changed the Bible. And his Keith's point is actually no, Bart's thesis works far better for the Quran, actually, where it does seem in early Islam there was an attempt to impose homogeneity upon the texts. And others have carried that work on. Another name to throw in there for people to check into. There's a friend of mine and a wonderful scholar of the Quran called Dan Brubaker. And Dan's done work looking at early Quran manuscripts and showing places where the later scribes have come and made changes to those manuscripts. And in some cases, not all, some cases just fixing things like spelling mistakes and so forth. But in many cases, you can show an attempt to bring the text into line with what orthodoxy thought the Quran should say, rather than what the Quran actually did say. And in the case of the New Testament manuscripts, I always say to Muslims, go look at them. The best repository of biblical manuscripts in the world is at Dallas Theological Seminary, where Dan Wallace, a wonderful scholar of the New Testament, has built this incredible computerized tool and database of biblical manuscripts. Christians are not hiding from this work. We're pioneering it. Why is it? On the Quran, it's had to be, Western secular scholars or Christian scholars or Jewish scholars. Why is it non-Muslims have had to come and do this work on the Quran? Why is it Muslims have shied away from this? I think because it undercuts one of their key beliefs that pins up the whole of Islam.
What makes me curious now is what is the history of this objection? I don't want to get into a whole side discussion on this, but it makes me wonder if this discussion or if this objection has been around for a long time and just it doesn't make any sense anymore because of how much information we have about textual criticism, the New Testament, and maybe it's just a sort of outdated objection that has just kind of stuck around because it hasn't really seeped through what we know from scholarship and from academia, hasn't gotten all the way down to the popular level and to these objections that people are throwing around. It's just something I'm thinking out loud about. You feel free to comment on that.
Yes, I think in a nutshell, Cameron, you're right. I think there is definitely a degree that there's a disconnect between popular Islam and what's going on in academia. I mean, a good example of that is I'm part of a network of scholars of the Quran that meet once a year, an academic network called the International Quran Studies Association. And probably the 200 or 300 of us who meet for the annual conference, probably about half might be Muslims. Maybe about sort of 25% would be Christians and the other 25% miscellaneous. But I'm always interested in what can be said from the front. So, a scholar can stand at the front of one of those conferences and talk about the Quran's use of, earlier tradition. And there'll be very little grumbling from the audience, including the Muslim audience. So I think a lot of Muslim academics are aware of these issues and are trying to figure out how to process them. You then meet the kind of Muslim in the street, and it's like it's all perfect, it's unchanged, and no critical issues. Now, I want to be scrupulously fair because I think it's important as Christians we are fair. Sometimes the same goes on in the church. There can be a gap between the scholarship and what goes on in the pews. And that's why we mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier. I mean, I think some of Bart's attacks on the Bible have played on that. Not a lot of Christians are not aware that there are passages in the New Testament, like the women caught in adultery, for example, is the famous example, or the long ending of Mark, probably shouldn't be there. We know that. Scholars have known that for hundreds of years. But that's not always trickled down. And so, a skeptic like Bart can come along and make a real great song and dance routine about, look at this. And so we need to make sure as Christians we're not guilty of the same, that we're putting the best information, the best scholarship into the hands of the laity where we can. But Islam, that's a massive disconnect. But very quickly, the argument itself, though, is a later one in Islam. If you read the Quran is pretty positive about the former scriptures. Whenever the Quran mentions the Torah, the Old Testament, or mentions the Injil, which is the gospel, the word it tends to use for the New Testament, always very positive. And in fact, in the first couple of centuries of Islam, Muslims mined the Bible. They would go to the Bible to explain the Quran, because the Quran would make an elusive reference. Muslims wouldn't know what it meant, and so Muslim scholars would quite be very open to, well, let's go and see what the Bible says. When Islam got more established as an empire, what then began to happen was there was a sense in the scholarly class, I think, of we don't want any more connection to Judaism and Christianity. We can stand on our own 2 feet. And actually also, because there were now theological debates happening with Jews and Christians, then things got a bit nastier. And there was the kind of, Islam has come to supersede, to replace these other religions. The Bible's been corrupted. But that takes about 2 centuries after Muhammad to get going. But of course, there's a problem for Muslims. For Christians listening to this, maybe you're thinking, I can't handle the textual critical stuff. It's quite a complex argument. There's a very simple theological pushback to Muslims. When I hear a Muslim tell me the Bible's being corrupted, Cameron, I often like to say to them, well, okay, help me out here. Were the former scriptures corrupted because Allah couldn't protect his former scriptures, or because he wouldn't protect them? In other words, have you got a God who's powerless, and he's sitting up there in heaven watching humans interfere with his scripture, and he's going, oh man, I wish I could do something, but I'm just so weak? Or is he a God who couldn't be bothered? He literally couldn't be bothered, which is incredible, because in Islam, there is no incarnation. Jesus doesn't come in the flesh like he does in Christianity. The best thing you have are the scriptures. So how on earth could Allah, allow the corruption of the only way that human beings can know the truth? So for Muslims who want to claim the Bible has been corrupted, I always turn that around and say that ends up as a damning indictment on the God they believe in. And I would not want to be in their shoes on the day of judgment when God thunders at them, how dare you bring my character into disrepute like that?
I feel like I could talk to you for about 4 hours on just every single topic that we briefly touch on. But it's probably time to move on to the second reason why Muslims ought to take Christianity seriously. So just as a quick review, number 1 was that the Quran doesn't stand up to the terms, the claims that are made in favor of it. And then the second one, we're turning to, I think you said Muhammad. Yeah.
So Islam stands on 2 pillars, Cameron. We talked about the Quran, and it stands on Muhammad. Interestingly, those 2 pillars are deeply interconnected. They're almost circular, because one of the critiques that was leveled at Muhammad, even during his career, was people would say to him, if you read the Quran and the Islamic histories, people would say to him, where's your miracle? You claim to be a prophet. All the previous prophets did miracles, right? Moses had the Red Sea and all the miracles with Pharaoh. Jesus did miracles, and so on and so forth. So where are your miracles? And this was a problem for Muhammad in his career. And what begins to happen is in early Islam, when that accusation was raised by Jews and Christians, Muslims began to say, well, the Quran is Muhammad's miracle. We touched on this earlier, because Muhammad was illiterate. How could he produce this? So the Quran was the miracle that validated Muhammad. So now you've got a circle going on. Why is the Quran a scripture from God? Well, it's come through a prophet. How do we know he's a prophet? Because of the Quran. And this whole thing goes round and round and round. And it's hard to break out of that loop. But Muhammad, we need to look at, because Muhammad, although Muslims, we need to be very clear, don't worship him, don't consider him to be divine in any way. He is considered to be the most supreme example of humankind who's ever lived. The perfect example for all of us to be following, and of course the one through whom God communicated his final revelation. So we need to take a long, hard look at Muhammad. And when we do that, Cameron, I think two things stand out. One is when you actually...
Before you do that, real quick, hold that in your mind. So I have a quick question about... We, as Christians, we think that Jesus was sinless. Do Muslims think that Muhammad was sinless?
Oh, now here you raise a really interesting question. If you ask a lot of Muslims today, if you ask your Muslim friend or neighbor or colleague, hey, just out of interest, tell me about Muhammad. Do you believe he was sinless? Many, not all, but many will say yes. Many have been taught that Muhammad never sinned. What's interesting, that's not really supportable from either the Quran or from the Hadith. In the Quran, Muhammad is instructed to ask for repentance for his sins, for his faults. And in the Hadith, you could even find traditions reporting to be prayers of Muhammad. Muhammad prays that Allah would remove his sins from him as far as the east is from the west, echoes of the biblical language there. So I think the early Islamic tradition was very open to the fact that Muhammad was a sinner like everybody else. In fact, if you read the Quran and the Hadith carefully, there's only one sinless person, and that's Jesus, which is very, very interesting. But many Muslims today are not aware of this. So actually, I often on my iPhone, in my notes app, will carry those Quran verses or those Hadith references, because I found it helpful with Muslim friends to say, well, what do you make of this, and then just show them. But yeah, if you read the traditions themselves, no, he wasn't sinless.
The reason why I asked that question is because I think it might help provide some context. It sounds like what you're about to do is argue that he wasn't the most moral person. And so maybe that's not what you're about to argue, but that it seemed like it was good to get some context about what.
Yes, no, exactly.
Some expectations, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great, Cameron. I'm going to argue two things. Before I do that, I want to be very, very careful to say to listeners, whether you're listening to this and you're a Christian or just a kind of skeptic listening along because you enjoy Cameron's show, we can get in our engagement with Muslims. Let's be respectful. I want to offer a critique, but I don't want to be rude. And those two things are not the same. You don't have to be rude and insulting in order to make a strong point. And I'm very conscious for any Muslims listening to this that you respect Muhammad tremendously. I understand that. And I would not want to just insult you just for the sheer fun of it. That would be hugely inappropriate and unchristian. But we can still ask questions. And the two questions I would ask, the first concerns the historicity, how much we can actually know about Muhammad. So to give a comparison here, Cameron, in the case of Jesus and the Gospels, those four Greco-Roman biographies we have of him in the New Testament, they are all written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. The very latest date for the last of the Gospels to be written, John's Gospel, is probably about AD 90. And in fact, the dates on the Gospels have generally shifted a little bit earlier, actually, in recent years. I myself would put them all before 70. I've not seen a compelling case that any of the four gospel writers were aware of the fall of Jerusalem when they're writing. I think that's still a very powerful argument. But even if you go with the slightly later datings, all within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and that's important because as historians, when we want to know about any figure from history, Jesus of Nazareth, the Roman Caesars, or Muhammad, we want eyewitness testimony. So we're on good ground with the Gospels. When it comes to Muhammad, the first biography we have of him, written by a gentleman called Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq died in 767. That's 130 years after Muhammad. So even if you have him writing his biography in the early part of his career, you're still really struggling in terms of the eyewitness end. You really are beyond the lifetime of people who are still alive who would have remembered Muhammad. But things get worse. We don't have Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad. It hasn't been preserved for us. We only have preserved a version of it that was edited by another scholar called Ibn Hisham. And Ibn Hisham dies in 833 AD. That's 200 years after the death of Muhammad. And Hisham tells us that he removed things from Ibn Ishaq's biography that it was not appropriate or helpful for the pious to read. So you find yourself thinking, okay, there are some quite interesting bits in what he's passed on to us. What did he leave out? Because there are examples of, Muhammad being pretty brutal on the battlefield. There are the many women that Muhammad married or had relationships with that, again, one might ask a question mark about here. There's Muhammad's use of torture that's reported on at least one occasion, if not a couple of occasions. So one wonders as a historian, what's Ibn Hisham left out? But that means we have a problem with the time gap of the sources of how we can be sure. The other thing we find that's interesting is the later you go in Islamic history, the more detail you see. This has been remarked upon for years. So if you read the earliest Islamic historians writing, people like Ibn Ishaq and others, they might mention that a battle took place. You go 200 years later, and later historians are not just telling us a battle took place, they'll tell us how many people died. They'll tell us the names of the people who fought. They'll tell us the names of their camels and their first cousins. And the amount of detail is incredible. That's suspicious as historians. Normally, the further you get away, you begin to lose touch with primary data. You don't see it being generated. And all of those things have led critical historians to say, there are big questions about how much we can know about the historical Muhammad, and how much we actually know and how much is hearsay. And particularly one of the problems we have with Muhammad, I think, Cameron, is that the Quran tells us very little about Muhammad. He's only mentioned 4 times by name in the Quran. But it gives us a few hints in places, but nothing more than. You get a hint in the Quran that he was possibly an orphan, for example. And then along come the biographers writing 100, 200 years later, and you have all this incredible backstory. And that's led many critical historians to say, well, does Ibn Ishaq tell us stories about Muhammad losing his parents because that's what happened? Or is it that he read the Quran, saw this allusion to the fact that his prophet was an orphan, and so then built the stories around there? Where does story end and history begin? Where does history end and story begin? And it's very difficult to separate fact from fiction in terms of early Islam. So that's one of the big problems with Muhammad, how much we can actually be sure of. And historians have long said that, we would love to have for Muhammad the likes of some of the background information we have for Jesus. So for Jesus, we have, all of those other historians writing around the time period that we can, interlock with the Gospels. We have Roman writers like Tacitus. We have Jewish writers like Josephus. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of which give us confidence when we read the Gospels, because when the Gospels make claims about the time period, we can compare those and go, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. The Gospels talk about the Pharisees. We can see what Josephus tells us about the Pharisees and see, what's going on here. We have none of that for early Islam. We have no other background information. So we're working a little bit in a void. So we have the question of how much we can know about Muhammad. And then you want to come back on some of that. But the second piece we want to talk about a little bit is his character. But let me throw it back to you if there's anything you want me to clarify, because we've covered quite a lot there in those 5 minutes.
No, I think that's good. The main thing that it seemed like the main point that you were hitting at was that we just don't know a whole lot about him. We've got to be somewhat skeptical, given that the first biography was written about 100 to 130 years after his death, right? And then the next one was actually the edited version of that one. So it seemed like it
200,
was
200, yeah.
Yeah. So a question that I have is, like, wouldn't this apply to the Old Testament too? Because we have, even with the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's still a big time gap between when these events allegedly happened versus when we have the first written materials of them.
Yeah, that's a very good and a very fair question. I'd say a couple of things. I'd say what's really interesting is certainly when it comes to the Old Testament, particularly you look back at the time of, say, Abraham and the patriarchs, you are before writing, you're in an era of oral tradition. And so, we don't have the ability to check things as much as we would like. Although, oddly enough, actually, we do in other places. There are places where we can make contact with history. So, one of the fun little historical facts is in the Joseph story in Genesis, off the top of my head, Genesis 36, somewhere around about there. It's the part of the Joseph story where Joseph is sold by his brother to the Midianites as a slave, and he's sold for I think the exact number, but he's sold for a few shekels of silver. Now, what's interesting is two things going on here. A shekel was a dry weight; it wasn't a coin, because at the time the Joseph story is taking place, coins coins have not yet been invented. We also know from other kind of tablets that archaeologists have discovered from some of the ancient Near Eastern communities around that part of the Fertile Crescent, we actually know the price for a slave at the time that Joseph was sold, and the price that's quoted in Genesis is pretty much right on the money. So it doesn't prove that Genesis is history, but it's little points where it touches history. Things like some of the king lists that turn up when Abraham goes and fights the kings early on in Genesis. We found the names of those kings mentioned there in Genesis, mentioned in other ancient Near Eastern documents from the region in the same order, which is interesting. So again, just little contact points in history. Oddly enough, actually, the Joseph story turns up in Surah 12, chapter 12 of the Quran, and it retells the story. And the fun thing there is when Joseph is sold by his brothers in the Quran, the price he's sold for is a few dirhams, and dirham was a coin. So the Quran makes a slight historical anachronism there. That's another sort of famous issue there in the Quran. But here's the thing. With the Old Testament, it's about as good as we'd expect. And so we do, to some degree, take it on trust for oral tradition, and where we can put it to the test. And also, the other thing I'd say as a Christian is, look, if I can establish who Jesus is, and there's a whole argument there for the resurrection we won't go into. You've probably done podcasts on that. Once I have credibility, once Jesus in my mind has credibility, and Jesus trusted the Old Testament, I'm willing to put a fair degree of trust on the Old Testament that way. Jesus took it seriously. I trust Jesus, therefore I'll take it seriously. The problem with the Quran is this. Sorry, go ahead.
No. Finish your thought.
To finish the thought, the problem for the Quran is coming from a point where we should have good historical stuff. It's coming from the 600s. Muhammad dies in 632 AD. The Arabic Peninsula is just shifting into literacy. It's not fully there, but it's coming and it's beginning. The codex has been invented. The parchment's been invented. There is no reason why it should take us 200 years to have a decent biography of Muhammad. What the heck is going on? All of the technology, all of the traditions are there. Remember that within 20 years of Muhammad's death, Islam has expanded out of Arabia and is conquering former Christian territory. It's hoovering up technologies like writing and parchment and scribal technologies. Some of those early Quran manuscripts, some of our earliest Quran manuscripts date from the end of the 7th century. They're pretty beautiful documents. So that how is it where they could write the early Qurans really nicely, in some cases on high quality parchment with high production values, yet they couldn't get a biography of Muhammad out the door for about 2 centuries. So it's what we should expect versus what we actually have is the problem. The other fun thing as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say to bring it back to the 2 points that you were making about Muhammad. It sounds like there's the second one can go like this basically. Well, assume that the documents that we do have are accurate. This is what I would say about that. Sounds like that's the kind of move that you could make there. Absolutely.
And then I think that the second half of the piece on Muhammad, Cameron, comes into saying, look, even if we grant the Muslim biographies of Muhammad every possible benefit of the doubt, we bend over backwards and go, okay, we're just going to turn off our critical lenses as historians and just give lots of free passes that we wouldn't give to any other document, but we'll do that. Then we have a couple of issues. One is Muhammad's character. We'll come to that in a moment. The other thing, which we'll just touch on, is there's beginning to be work done suggesting that some of the pretty basic facts we'd assumed about early Islam may not be in fact the case. And there's a really interesting debate brewing in scholarship right now around where Islam actually began. If you ask most people, where did Islam begin? Where did Muhammad start his career? Most people who know anything about Islam are going to say Mecca. That's where Muhammad began. Surely that's why Muslims pray in that direction. But there's increasing evidence suggesting that actually it looks like Islam may have begun much further north in the Arabian Peninsula. There's been a number of pieces of work that have led into that conclusion. It's been observed in sort of recent scholarship that every geographical reference in the Quran is up in northern Arabia. All the place names that are mentioned are northern places, and that's particularly interesting because Muhammad was in the habit, according to the Quran and the Hadith, of sort of preaching sermons that went a bit like, look at the ruins around you of all these previous civilizations. Allah judge them. If you don't believe in Islam, he'll judge you. Well, all those kind of ruins of previous civilizations are all up north. Think of Petra is the classic example. There's a little reference in the Quran where Muhammad gives the example of the tomb of Job or Lot. My brain's temporarily gone on which one it is. One of the patriarchs from the Old Testament, and refers to the fact that you pass this every day on the way to prayer. But the traditional site of that was up in Damascus. So what is that doing if Muhammad's preaching down in Mecca? And then there's been work done by several scholars looking at the prayer direction of some of the earliest mosques in Islam. And those seem to be pointing not to Mecca, but to somewhere further north. And there's some debate about where that location is and exactly what's going on. But again, it's another big question mark written over early Islam. And there was a wonderful critical scholar of Islam, died a few years ago, called Patricia Kroner, based at Princeton University, brilliant historian and writer of many books on these issues. And she basically said time and again, look, as historians, we need to constantly be asking the question, what's the evidence and how do we know? And the problem is in Islam, for too long, scholars have simply read the hadith and taken it as gospel. We need to ask the critical question to which we are committed as historians. And when you do that, all kinds of problems begin. So I think the early evidence for Muhammad is shaky, to say the least. And to my Muslim friends, I never go the whole way and say, look, he didn't exist or anything like that. I simply say, look, how do we know what we think we know? What's the evidence? And I always say to my Muslim friends, you can ask Christians the same question. As Christians, we need to be willing to give the reasons why we believe, and we need to say the same to our Muslim friends.
Okay, so let's. Are there any other thoughts that you have before moving on to the third question, and then we'll do some Q&A?
The last one was simply we won't touch on it too long, Cameron, because we want to fit as much in as we can. It's the issue of Muhammad's character, and this is the most sensitive one. There are just some examples there that come out from the biographies of Muhammad that you have to raise questions. And to me, one of the most famous ones is the story told in Ibn Ishaq's biography, passed on through Ibn Hisham, that says that just after the Muslim armies had conquered a Jewish oasis town, the town of Khaybar, up in there in Arabia, Muhammad was sort of walking around the battlefield, and to him was brought a Jewish member of the community there called Kinana, and Muhammad was told that this gentleman had some treasure buried, and that he was refusing to tell the Muslims where it was. And Muhammad's instruction, reported there in the biographies, is take him away, kindle a bonfire on his chest, and basically burn him until he reveals where it is. And that's what they did. They took the guy away, lit a bonfire on his chest, and of course, as he might, he screamed out where the location was, and then his head was struck off. And so with my Muslim friends, I'm very conscious of how that feels when you hear that story. And what I often do with Muslim friends is simply read that story and say, look, this is in your tradition. This is not a hostile account. This is one of the earliest biographies of Muhammad. What do you do with it? What do you do with this? I know how I would feel if, I turned the pages of Matthew's gospel, and in Matthew chapter 13, I had Jesus, torturing people. I know what that would do to my faith as a Christian. I'd have huge problems here. What do you do as a Muslim? So I think there's many examples like that. And my conclusion after some years of studying, Muhammad, I'm more of a Quranic specialist, but it overlaps with Muhammad, is I think I want to be careful not to go the other way and totally demonize the guy. I would say that Muhammad was a very powerful, very effective, very charismatic war leader. He was a warrior. He built a great empire. He built the foundations of a great empire. He unified the Arabian tribes, who are a bunch of Bedouins who'd been at each other's throats for centuries. He had the kind of power and the charisma and the ability to do that. That takes a special kind of leader. I put him in the same bracket as a kind of Alexander the Great or a Genghis Khan. He was a war leader. He was a leader of men. That doesn't make him a good example for the 21st century. Makes him a very effective leader if you want to unify a bunch of fighters in the 7th century and build the foundations of a civilization and set them going onto the road to empirehood. But just as I wouldn't want to bring Alexander the Great into the 21st century and suggest he was a leader for today, so I think the best place to leave Muhammad is there in the 7th century, one of the great figures of history, one of the great empire builders, but not a figure for today.
Well, we're going to turn to some Q&A, and I haven't seen a whole lot of questions pop up. We actually have a good deal of Muslims, it looks like, in the live chat tonight. So if you have a question for Dr. Bannister, leave it in the live chat. You don't have to tag me. I'm looking at it right now. So if you have a question, just write it in there, address it to him if you'd like, and I'll throw it up on the screen. We'll do as many questions as we can. If you want to send it as a super chat, that's a way to guarantee that your question will be asked today. And with that, as the questions start to come in, was there anything else that you'd like to add? Or I know that we had like a bonus reason why.
Yeah, so the bonus was, let's throw it in there, Cameron, and then we can move into questions as they come. The third one really was the figure of Jesus. You know, I find it fascinating that Jesus is there in the Quran. He's mentioned 90 times. He's talked about 90 times. 90 verses in the Quran talk about Jesus. And, you know, to Muslims, he's very significant. And I know many Muslim friends who you know, respect and admire Jesus. He's considered a prophet in Islam. But I think what's interesting is when you look at the Jesus of the Quran and you compare him with the Jesus of the Gospels, two things leap right out of me. Firstly, as we've touched on, the Jesus of the Quran is a sort of shadowy cardboard cutout, abstracted from history. The Quran takes Jesus out of the 1st century, brings him into the 7th century, and really kind of loses everything that made him distinct. And I find it fascinating that when you look at critical kind of secular historians today, you know, even at the most kind of, you know, sort of left-wing end of history, historians who are willing to go to all kinds of strange places and build all kinds of strange theories on Jesus, you know, from the Gnostic Gospels and goodness knows whatever, none of them will go to the Quran. I don't know of any historian who would consider the Quran to be a place to go to Jesus. Yet if Jesus is that significant and we want to know what he's really like, I say to my Muslim friends, that's a problem. The other problem that flows out of that is, of course, although the Quran denies that Jesus was crucified, the Quran still suggests that people tried to crucify him. And one of my challenges to Muslim friends is why would anyone try and crucify the Jesus of the Quran? He wandered around, he did a few little miracles, he told a few sort of, you know, taught a few people, but not enough impact that the Quran feels it needs to relate what that teaching was. But somehow opposition arose enough that people want to try and kill him. Why is that precisely? And again, you need to go to the Gospels to get that answer. So the Quran lets us down badly. But then finally, the whole issue of Jesus in the Quran and the Bible, Cameron, connects that brilliant question you asked me about, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And, you know, when I meet Muslims who say they believe in a God of love, and many of my Muslim friends would say they do, you know, the question I always like to ask is, I say, well, okay, let's think about love for a moment. And in particular, let's think about what the greatest form of love is. You know, and I find it interesting, if you ask anybody that question, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, or atheist, what's the greatest form of love? Almost everybody comes up with the same answer: self-sacrifice. We all know that. The parent who lays down their life to save a child, you know, the soldier who gives his life to save the rest of the platoon. History is full of examples of self-sacrifice. We all know that's the greatest form of love. And Jesus said this too: greater love hath no man than he lays down his life for his friends. Well, here's the problem I say to my Muslim friends. You know, if Allah is a God of love, then the love that God demonstrates must be the greatest form of love, because God is the greatest at anything he does. He's the greatest judge. He's the greatest creator. He's the greatest knower. He's the greatest lover if he's a God of love. So here's the thing. If self-sacrifice is the greatest form of love, and God demonstrates the greatest form of love, then God, by definition, must be a God who can demonstrate self-sacrificial love. And if he hasn't, you or I could go out and give our life for one of our children, and we've demonstrated greater love even than God has done. And how does that work? And here's the thing, and the heart of who Jesus is. If Jesus is who the New Testament says that he is, not just a teacher, not just someone who told wonderful stories and did amazing miracles and inspired people, but somebody who was actually God himself in the flesh, then what we see when Jesus' willingness to go to the cross, which is the heart of his story in the New Testament Gospels, is the greatest act of love demonstrated by the greatest being in the universe, God himself. And who Jesus is isn't just some question of history. It gets us into that much bigger question, Cameron, of who is God, and what does he think about us, and is he a God of love, and is he a God who's demonstrated that love by giving his very own life that we might know him and be in relationship with him. And it's as you look at Jesus that those massive differences between Christianity and Islam come right out.
Well, that's a perfect time to, great. That was awesome. Okay, well, let's move on to Slam RN has a question. She says, I wonder if Dr. Bannister knows Hatun Tash. I hope that's the way you say that. Has he met her at Speaker's Corner? She tells the story of the adult male suckling manuscript eaten by a sheep.
Yes. Great question. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, I know Hatun a little bit. So yeah. So Speaker's Corner that I mentioned in my bio at the start, and there's been a whole team of people over the years, and she's one of the more recent people who've been doing work there. Amazing kind of background, Turkish background from memory. I've met her a few times, and what I admire about Hatun is I've never met anybody who's got so much energy. I mean, the woman is unstoppable in terms of, I don't think she even sleeps. Anytime she's not engaging and sharing her faith with Muslims, she spends it researching, and she's pretty tenacious. There was a story, some of you listening to this may know, that a few years ago now, she was speaking, I believe, at a mosque in London, and afterwards was actually beaten up really, really badly. I want to stress that's not the experience of most people when they do mosque visits, but this conversation there became quite difficult, and there was some very radical types there, and she was incredibly badly beaten. And in fact, the group of mob who were trying to beat her up, I believe, were in the process of stringing her up to a lamppost when the police turned up and intervened. She spent a couple of weeks in hospital, and the very first thing that Hatun did after she left hospital was go straight back to the mosque where this incident had happened, walk back in and start the conversation that had finished 2 weeks ago. And the result of that, several Muslims gave their lives to Christ. So she is incredibly brave woman, and she's very, very good at digging up these kind of problems in early Islam. And the story of the adult male suckling manuscript eaten by a sheep that you've wonderfully brought up is a story in the Hadith traditions. It's quite a complex story. I'll do my very, very best to synthesize it. And if you want the slightly longer version, there's a evangelist apologist to Muslims called David Wood, who some of you may be aware of. If you go to David Wood's website, it's late here in the UK, my brain has temporarily escaped me on what his website is, but if you put David Wood into, or Cameron, you may know this.
Act 17 Apologetics.
There we go. Thank you. If you put Sheepgate, the Sheepgate controversy into the search engine at David Wood's site, you'll find he does a wonderful version of the story. And basically, it's a story about there was a kind of legal ruling in early Islam dealing with the question of how could a woman be present in a room with an adult male who is not her close relative, because early Islamic law said you can only be, if you're a woman, you can only be in a room with a man who's your father or a close relative of your husband. And apparently, Mohammed allegedly came up with the idea of saying, well, all that has to happen if the man breastfeeds the woman a number of times, she will be considered his adopted son, and then there'll be family, they can be together. And you just think through the implications of that idea. How does that work precisely? And apparently, according to traditions, Muhammad's wives were not very happy with this idea, and there was a lot of controversy and pushback. And lo and behold, shortly after Muhammad died, and all the confusion and chaos after he passed away, his favourite wife, Aisha, recounted the story that in the chaos after he died, lo and behold, her tame sheep had wandered into the house and had eaten some manuscripts on which parts of the Quran had been written. And lo and behold, this verse about the adult breastfeeding of men by women was one of the verses that had been eaten. Would you believe it? And thus it was lost. Now, I have to say there's controversy around that story as to, how reliable it is and so on and so forth. But it is certainly referenced in a lot of the early Hadith and traditions, and it's told as gospel by some of those early Hadith traditions. David, as I say, goes into great detail on his website. If you watch his video on it, he'll show you the Hadith and the Arabic and the English. You can follow the story through, and it's just another lovely little story of the possible fluidity of the early Quran. In this case, caused by a sheep.
All right,
one for
so
you.
We have.
That's a bad joke for you.
Okay, so we have a question from a friend of mine, Brett. He says, question for your stream. He talks about the Quran's use of myths. Why does this not apply to Paul's mention of Janus and Jambres in 2 Timothy 3:8?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the question you'd have to ask contextually is Paul telling that story in such a way as he's giving a historical spin, or is he telling it as a piece of tradition that he knew his readers would know? And we know from pieces like Acts 17, where he's engaging there in the Areopagus, that he was well conversant with legends and myths and stories and the literature. So I think I would argue and this is probably too technical to go into on the channel here, but a good commentary will take you into this. That I think Paul is quite deliberately engaging with the stories that his readers know. He's also, of course, not claiming in Timothy to be telling history. He's writing a letter to somebody. He's writing an epistle form. The Quran, on the other hand, is claiming to be giving us history. A good example of that would be, where genre matters would be the Gospels, for example. If in the middle of the Gospels we found that story, in amidst the Sermon on the Mount or something, then I think we'd have some explaining to do as Christians. The Bible certainly does retell stories. There's a couple of examples in the Old Testament where that may be going on. The question is, what's the genre? Is it being presented as history? And is the reader being given enough information that they can figure out, okay, this is a historical claim, or this is simply a teaching example? And I think what Paul is doing is just throwing it in there as an example. I think that's what's going on.
Okay, so we have a super chat from David LaRosa. Thank you so much for your super chat, David. He says, Muhammad believed the satanic verses were the result of divine dictation until realizing he was deceived by Satan. If Allah is the greatest deceiver of all, how do they know that Islam is the true way and not another deception?
David, that's a really good question. And raising the satanic verses, actually, thank you for that, David. I mean, for listeners who are not familiar with the satanic verses, this is one of the very, very controversial episodes in early Islam. In fact, there was a Iranian author called Salman Rushdie, British Iranian author called Salman Rushdie, who got into trouble, 20, 30 years ago now, maybe even longer, because he wrote a very famous book called The Satanic Verses. And there was a fatwa issued against him by the Iranians, and he had to live in hiding with police protection for a good many years. And a lot of Western commentators and journalists missed the issue. Yes, he got in trouble because he was a bit rude about Islam in the book, but he got into as much trouble because the very title of the book cast this spotlight on this incredibly embarrassing incident in early Islam. And the story goes like this: that when Muhammad was trying to win over the Meccans, the Meccans, his fellow Meccans there in Arabia in the first part of his career, they were polytheists. They believed in many gods. And Muhammad was having trouble getting traction for Islam. He's getting a lot of pushback. And he suddenly claimed to have had a revelation that alongside Allah, people could worship three other Arabian tribal deities. And on hearing that, the Meccans were like, well, that's fantastic. Oh, that's great. That's okay. If we can have Allah and also have our goddesses as well, that'd be brilliant. Perfect. No problem at all. And then a short while after, Muhammad the angel Gabriel tells Muhammad, what have you done? That wasn't me who revealed those to you. That wasn't Allah revealing those verses to you. That was Satan whispering those into your ears. And Muhammad retracted that verse and gave a new one, and that's the one that stands in the Quran today, that actually mocks those Arabian tribal deities. Now, the problem is, as David highlights beautifully here, how is it that Muhammad, who's supposed to be the final prophet of God, bearer of the last revelation, could literally get that confused and not be able to know the difference between that which is from God and that which isn't, until basically Gabriel comes along and goes, what on earth do you think you're doing? And so that raises a much bigger question around, how much you can trust Allah. And actually, it's interesting. When you read the Quran through, you'll notice that the Quran regularly gives titles or descriptions to God in the Quran. He's the most merciful. He's the most forgiving. Those are the two most common ones. And Muslim scholars gathered those names together and collected them. And some of you may have heard of the so-called 99 names of Allah. Well, one of those names in the Quran that is used is the deceiver. Allah is the greatest of deceivers. And so that's a little bit unnerving to see that there. And as a Christian reader of the Quran, perhaps the greatest place that comes out is in chapter 4, verse 157 of the Quran, where the Quran says, the Jews say they killed Jesus, the son of Mary, the Messiah, but verily they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but Allah just made it appear as if they had. And later Islamic commentators came along and expanded that idea. And many Muslims today believe that a substitute was crucified in the place of Jesus. The idea is that Allah cast the likeness of Jesus onto somebody else. Judas Iscariot is a common contender for that honor. And, Judas was crucified while Jesus kind of slipped out the back door. And I've heard that story from many Muslim friends. And I always say to them, the question is exactly David's question. How can you trust a God who would deceive people that fundamentally over something so important as to the way of salvation. I say to Muslim friends, the reason there are 2 billion Christians today who are not following Islam but are following Jesus is because, Allah did this great deception. And then, of course, you just turn the thing around and say, how can you be sure that the joke's not on you? Maybe if Allah is a great deceiver, maybe Islam is the practical joke and Christianity is the truth. Compare that with the God of the Bible, who I think truth is one of his attributes. And of course, Jesus, God in the flesh, God with us, described himself as the way, the truth, and the life.
Okay, so maybe we might have time for maybe one or two more questions. Here's one from Crab King. He says, who do you think the best Muslim debater is?
That's a really good question. There are two people I think. Well, there are three people actually I would mention that I think are worth noting. One is no longer with us. There was a Muslim debater and polemicist called Ahmed Deedat who lived in South Africa, and he was pretty relentless. He popularized Muslim apologetics. He really sort of brought it into the main stage. And I'd say many of his arguments were not particularly good, but rhetorically he was incredibly clever. And, to read his works today, you've got to admire his ability to spin an argument. And look, you don't have to agree with somebody to respect their writing. I don't agree with Richard Dawkins, the atheist writer, but man, that guy can write. And Deedat wrote really well and really popularized this stuff. So I think he's worth a mention. And then there's an Indian Muslim debater called Zakir Naik. Again, fearsome polemicist, and has run rings around lots of Christians because he just talks so fast. You think I talk fast? I've got nothing on Zakir. And Zakir's ability to just go like a machine gun through arguments is very impressive. Again, I would say when you stop and slow him down and dissect them, they're not the greatest arguments. But, though many of us watching this know that it's not just an argument, it's the way you convey it. And then thirdly, I mentioned him already, Shabir Ali. And what I like about Shabir is more nuanced. Shabir is more willing to recognize there are issues. He realizes there are some big questions to answer. I would actually say it's interesting that Shabir, I think, shies away from debating topics around Mohammed these days because I think he realizes there's a problem. He's increasingly shying away from the manuscripts, actually, because I think he realizes there's the problem. But he and I have had several debates and dialogues. He's a very capable scholar. He's very generous, very friendly. He's not rude, and I don't have a lot of time for people who are rude. I think that, we live in an age where we're so divided. We need Christians, Muslims, atheists to model how can we disagree and disagree respectfully, and Shabir does that well. So Shabir is my personal favorite Muslim debater. Because I like him. I like the man.
All right, here's the last question, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to answer this one because it looks like an interesting one from Marino Rogers. Muslims claim God would not kill or let his prophet die when it comes to Jesus, but how do they reconcile Muhammad's death in that same context? So the reason why I picked this question is because it might give you an opportunity to kind of explain the context where this question comes from.
Yeah. Well, Marino, thank you for that question. Brilliant. Some brilliant questions coming in tonight, and what a wonderful one for our last question. Yeah, so to take the two halves of that and unpack that for people. Absolutely. Muslims, the Quran hints at, actually, but later Islamic theology developed the idea not merely that prophets were sinless. You asked about this earlier, Cameron. Do Muslims believe that Muhammad is sinless? That was a later development in Islam. This idea that prophets were protected from sin and also protected from, from humiliation and sort of experiencing sort of suffering and so forth. And of course, that idea lies behind Surah 4:157 that Marino's referenced there, and I talked about a moment ago, that denies that Jesus was crucified. And if you talk to many Muslims about that verse, they will say things like, well, how on earth, how could Allah allow his prophet, someone of Jesus's importance and stature, to be humiliated by his enemies, by the Jews of all people, because the Quran is pretty negative about the Jewish community. How could that happen? And so therefore it didn't. QED, Allah rescued him. But yeah, your very point, Marino, there is a good one. The way that Muhammad's death happened, Muhammad's death was an interesting one. If you read the biographies, it's a little bit shadowy exactly what happens, but it looks like what happened is there was an attempt by a woman in the Jewish community there to poison him, to serve him a poisoned meal, because I think he may have killed her husband from memory. He'd done something to irritate her anyway, and so she tried to poison the Prophet of Islam. He survives. But if you read between the lines, he was never quite the same. He was obviously, it looks like he was quite badly injured by that episode. And as a historian, I'm a great believer in what we like to call the criterion of embarrassment, when a text reports something that's not favourable to the people reporting it. And so I think we're probably on good historical ground there. And so then Muhammad dies, a little while after that. And what's interesting is the Muslim community didn't see his death coming. That issue with the leadership that we talked about earlier, Cameron, Muhammad didn't see his death coming. He hadn't taken the time to appoint a successor. If he'd simply said, my successor should be this guy, that we wouldn't have the Sunni-Shia divide. So yeah, Marino's question then ends up front and center. If Allah protects his prophets, how could it possibly be the case that Muhammad had this sort of death that was partly brought on by being poisoned? Why didn't he have a very honourable death, handing on the baton to the next generation, and so on and so forth? But it's also interesting, and I want to leave you maybe with this. It's interesting to look at Muhammad's last words. And, Cameron, you and I share a friend in common. We discovered this talking before the show, and some of you listening to the channel may know the name Nabil Qureshi. And Nabil was a dear friend of mine, and I think, you knew him as too, Cameron. He had been a Muslim, became a Christian, dramatic conversion.
Actually, and wrote I didn't know Nabil. I know Mike Lacona.
Oh, you know his book? Yeah. Okay. So his book,
I read his
Jesus. Book. Amazing book. Well, Nabil died of cancer a couple of years ago, and David Wood, who we mentioned a few minutes ago, put together a really beautiful video shortly after Nabil died, just contrasting the last words of Jesus, the last words of Nabil, and the last words of Muhammad. Actually, it was in reverse order for important reasons. Muhammad's last words were on his deathbed were to curse Jews and Christians and demand they be banished from the Arabian Peninsula. And also, he also, interestingly, cursed anyone who would come and pray at his tomb. And some Muslims today will go and pray at the tomb of Muhammad. That's interesting. So he died cursing. Nabil, if you watch his final videos from his hospital bed, almost his last words were imploring Muslims to follow Christ and imploring Muslims and Christians to love one another and debate kindly with one another. He had this big heart for the Muslim community because his family were Muslim. And then, of course, Jesus' last words on the cross, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. And I think it's interesting, not merely how Muhammad died, but the words on his mouth were ones of vengeance and revenge. Compare that with the words of Jesus, and those words reflected in those who've authentically tried to follow him and put those words into action, like my friend Nabil. That there, I think, is the big difference between Islam and Christianity.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on tonight. I know that it's getting late there. You're probably ready to go hit the hay, so to speak. I appreciate you coming on. Is there anything you'd like to leave with the audience before we sign out?
No, this has been really, really good. And just to direct people to read further resources, if you really want to dig into some of the stuff I've talked about this evening, I mentioned SOLAS, the organisation I work for, SOLAS. Put that into Facebook. We've got lots of kind of videos and resources and articles where we go further into a lot of the stuff that we've talked about this evening, Cameron. It's all free, so just direct people there, and they can dig further into this.
Excellent. Thank you again for coming on. It's been a pleasure. We'll have to do something else on maybe atheistic apologetics, right? We talked about that. Maybe we can do something like that.
For another time. We should so do that. Blessings to you.
Okay. Well, let me talk to the audience real quick. So if you have enjoyed this conversation, this interview, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's the easy thing to do. It's also free. You can turn on the little bell to get notifications. And the last thing that I'll let you know is that we are a crowd-funded ministry. So patreon.com/capturing Christianity is the way to support this ministry, make sure that it continues to run, and that we can also expand our operations. I have some really, really cool ideas, especially once this pandemic is over. I want to start inviting people in the studio and doing more in-person interviews, make them live, and do some really cool things. So if you want to support this ministry, patreon.com/capturing Christianity is the way to do it. It's also linked in the description of this video. And I will leave you with this. Christianity is true. See you guys later.